take a hold of you. Take a hold of you. Take a hold of you.
As many of us can attest to, the healing journey is exactly that, a journey, a process that in the process of healing, in the process of change, there are certainly breakthroughs, some things that people would call miracles, but there's also the work, isn't there? You know, I come from generations of alcoholics. Both sides of my family. And because of that, there's been all kinds of abuse in my family tree. Physical, emotional, sexual abuse, it's all there. And when my parents came to faith, I witnessed a breakthrough, a miracle. I witnessed my parents walk away from alcohol on the spot. That's not everybody's story, but it's theirs. But then I witnessed years of working through the healing process from the effects of alcoholism and abuse in our family. And I think one of the challenges about having this conversation in the church, and maybe one of the reasons we need to have it, is that often we can talk about Jesus in this kind of miracle way, that the church or Jesus or this story is going to heal you, and then from then on, you don't have to worry about it. It's just going to be all good from there. And from my experience as a person and as a pastor and as someone who's been around the church since I was about 8 years old, is that I've seen it play out in both ways. That sometimes there are breakthroughs and miracles, but there's always then work to be done on the healing journey that we can't pretend, and that's what it is. It's pretending that the harm or the trauma and the effects of it do not exist. And I think this is baked, the wisdom of this is baked in some of our oldest pieces of the scriptures. I began sharing last week that in about 1,500 years before Jesus walks the earth, God's people are wandering a desert after being rescued from slavery by their leader Moses, and they're beginning to dream about this promised land that God has told them will come. And in the midst of this desert season, these stories emerge. Actually, probably the way it went down is these stories began to get written down. That these stories likely had emerged for generations before that orally. And as Moses begins to write down these stories, he tells this story of God. This God who made everything we can see and everything beyond what we can see. And then in the midst of this creation, it's described as a garden. God places humans, Adam, which means human, and Eve, which means the mother of all humanity. And in the midst, these two people, this humanity has all of this garden to enjoy, and God just says, hey, just stay away from this one tree. And in the story, they eat from that tree in an attempt to overcome God, in an attempt to be wiser or better or stronger than God. And in a moment, they are just filled with shame. Because the mandate that they were given, or the invitation they were given, was not to overcome God, but to care for all that God had created. Let me read this. Genesis chapter 1:28. God says this about the humans, that God blessed them and said to them, be fertile and multiply, fill the earth and master it. Now, master was not to consume it, but to care for it, to steward it. There's this perfect garden, and there's an order to things here, and you are created to care for it. And as they step outside of that, they feel shame. They hide from God and hide from each other. And God meets them in this moment, and his first words to them in Genesis 3 Or where are you? God seeks relationship, showing that he loves them and he likes them. And at the end of a conversation, the Bible says that God then clothed Adam and Eve, that he knit together leather clothes and dressed them, covering them in the midst of their shame. And as the story reads, then they have kids. Cain and Abel are born. These are two brothers. They are the children of Adam and Eve. And as the story reads, it feels like a new beginning. Certainly this next generation will learn from the mistakes. But Cain, eventually the older son, develops a lot of jealousy towards the younger son. And there's a conversation actually with Cain and God in the story in Genesis chapter 4. And this is what the Lord says to Cain. Why are you so angry and why are you so resentful towards your younger brother? If you do the right thing, won't you be accepted? But if you don't do the right thing, it says, then sin will wait at the door ready to strike. It will entice you, but you must rule over it. And so baked into this story with Cain and Abel is this invitation to Cain saying, listen, I know you're angry. I know you're resentful. You don't have to let that rule over you, but you can do the work to rule over that. But that's not how the story goes. Cain ends up murdering Abel. And then God comes to Cain, hiding from God, and asks Cain a question. And this is the big question in the text in Genesis 4:9. God says to Cain, Cain, where is your brother Abel? So if you've been reading in the story now, God has posed two ginormous questions. Where are you and where is your brother? As if to say the shalom of it all, the peace of it all, the order of it all in the garden is that God loves you, God likes you, and God is with you. And our response to that is to turn to God and care for each other as well. That there is this calling on us as people to care for the world and care for each other. Cain ends up going off and starting a city, the tale tells. And he has this boy, Enoch is his name. And Enoch builds this city. And this city, after generations, ends up in this place with this person, Lamech. Lamech would be like a great-great-great-grandson of Enoch. And there's this moment where it says Lamech took two wives. A shocking reality going back to the garden. That the male, the man, maybe the more physically dominant human, is now taking as possession not a wife, but two wives. Again, this system in this city, the powerful preying on the weak. But then generations later, we get a description of what is continuing to happen in this city. Genesis chapter 6 says this in verse 2, the divine beings. I want to pause there for a second because this is it's a really confusing part of the story. The divine beings, some people think the divine beings are like the sacred, like angels or some sort of like existence of a being that is not human but not God, somewhere in this middle space in this story, right? But others think the divine beings reference kingship, that it was very common in the Old Testament in this time to think of your king as divine, as being this human yet divine. One way or another, they are beings that are powerful over others. And at the full exposure of this city in Genesis chapter 6, the divine beings saw how beautiful the human women were, and they married the ones they chose. The deterioration of this garden finds itself in a city where those with power are preying on the powerless at an excessive rate. And then comes this story of a flood, a story that maybe you've seen paintings of or was told to you as a child. And this is a tough one because there are a lot of different camps on what's going on with this flood. Some think it's like a historical thing that happened. Some view it as an allegory. The point is not that conversation. People in the academy can argue about that all day. They like that stuff. The point is that it leads up. There's this story that's continuing on of new beginnings, people who don't reconcile with their past, and then a new beginning, and people who don't reconcile with their past, and then a new beginning in the flood. And there's a clue. After the flood, God says to Noah, the man who built the boat with his family, In Genesis 9:1, God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, get this, can you find the key here? Be fertile and multiply and fill the earth. When was the last time God said that? In the garden. It's this symbol, it's this moment to say, here's another new beginning. And again, one generation later, Noah's son Ham takes advantage of Noah in a vulnerable moment. Now the young are taking advantage of the old for their own gain. And then that city deteriorates, that generation deteriorates to a moment in Babylon when people are trying to conquer God once again by building this ginormous tower to take over the divine, which is this flash back to the garden when Adam and Eve tried to take over God. Can you see this pattern in the text throughout these first 11, 12 chapters of the story? As God's people are longing for the promised land, the message is, yes, a new beginning is coming. But if you think you can just ignore the past and create new patterns, you're wrong. That the work of healing is exactly that. It's work. And it's time, and we cannot ignore the things of the past just because God has given us a new beginning. And so today we're going to have a conversation, Rachel and I, about reconciliation with self and with others. And this conversation, warning, is going to get really complicated. But I'm happy that we can have it together. Why don't we welcome Rachel up here again. Well, thanks, Rachel. Again, it's been just a pleasure working on this series and this conversation with you. I'm so thankful for you and everything that God has created you to be and how that's expressing itself inside of our community right now. So cool, so cool. I wanted to open today and just give you an opportunity to maybe speak to anything from last week, something that captured your attention, something you wanted to clarify. I think every Sunday I get home and I'm like, I wish I would have said that, you know. So I just wanted to kind of open up to anything from last week capturing your attention that you wanted to speak to today.
Yeah. So I think the first thing that, even when I heard you practice your sermon last week was, like shame was never meant for you in the first place. It was never yours to carry. And I really want to reiterate that the body is good. I grew up in church and I wasn't told my body was good. And so I think knowing your bodies are good and they're communicating to you and it's all part of you is really important to know. It's interesting, people stop me about the shame narrative, like not recognizing how the shame plays out because we're not always aware of our thoughts or how that affects how we behave. And then even recognizing how like that affects every part of us, you know, how we have a little trauma or a big trauma can affect every little part of our lives, and maybe not understanding that until we talked about it in a little bit more of a tangible way.
That's good. That's good. That shame really becomes this like deterrent from, like, in the big image, right? Moving back towards the garden, looking at this peace on earth as shalom, as being the goal. I want to take some time today and talk about reconciliation. And I think reconciliation, we can talk about it as reconciliation with ourselves. That's a part of the process. And then reconciliation with others. And for the sake of conversation, we'll try and kind of separate these two questions, but I think they're pretty connected. But when we start talking about reconciliation with self, what does that look like for people?
Sure. Well, you have to realize there's a problem, right?
Right? I'm the problem. It's me.
Yeah.
I'm the problem. We can just sing
Not
this together.
everybody. The same thing keeps happening, and the problem might be you. But in all seriousness, I think there is an element in denial because facing a problem is really hard for people. I always think like what we keep in the dark is what keeps us in our cycles, right? So it might be trusting a good friend that you know will hold your stuff safely first, and then probably getting the help of a therapist if it's something that is affecting your life to really walk through understanding why that's happening and how to change some of those things.
Yeah, I tell, most of you may not know this, but I coach youth hockey. And so I'll often tell my players late in the season, we've lost a bunch of games, that if nothing changes, right? So if we keep doing the same things over and over again, we're going to keep seeing the same results. And so how does that play out then when we think about reconciliation with others? Because I think it's twofold. As we begin to reconcile with self and do our own work, we begin to either have new memories or new realizations. Breakthroughs in my own journey often can be revealing of like some of the people around me that I love and care for. Patterns that while I'm trying to heal, these patterns continue? How does that work out? How do we reconcile with other people?
Yeah, I think what you said about sometimes things come up for us, that can be very scary because it can feel a little bit, it's really dysregulating to have a memory come back about something big or small, right? And so I think one of the things I would speak to about that is nothing has changed for you except for now you have more information, right? It gives you more information of some areas you need to work on or some things you need to heal in your life. And so when I think about reconciliation to other people, I think that's really tricky because I think, you might not be, like you might not be, it's not your fault that you come from a family of alcoholism, right?
Yeah, I was born into it.
Yeah, that's not your fault. But you do have a responsibility to heal it. Like that is your agency and your choice, and only you can do that, right? Nobody can do it for you. And so I think when it comes to reconciliation to others, if you have wronged somebody, I think doing your own work of going through a therapeutic process and breaking those cycles and offering that forgiveness and then creating space for them to accept that in the space that they can.
And that gets really complicated in relationships, either in family or with friendships, because sometimes, actually often, it means we have to start setting either boundaries, just so we can create new behaviors. When my family first started working through all of this change, we literally had to move. Like we were living in a small town, come from a really big family that were like everywhere, and so we moved to go through the healing process, eventually move back. And that's like a physical representation, but I think that happens in real time too, where we need to set new boundaries with people in our lives, with systems in our life. But those conversations are difficult. There's a whole bunch of lies wrapped up inside of that. How do we do that? How do we kind of set those boundaries and almost have like good self-talk in the middle of it so we can live them out and live by them?
Yeah, I think boundaries are tricky because I think the way they're perceived is interesting. I think too, if you have a narrative of like setting a boundary is not loving or that's not the Christian thing to do, I think it actually is loving, because to me, boundaries are things that keep us emotionally safe and they keep our families emotionally safe and the people around us we love emotionally safe, and they can be whatever you need them to be. So if it's something where somebody has harmed you and there's not, I hear this all the time, like I am who I am, so there's no reconciliation, or it's something like majorly traumatic where it's just not going to happen. In the smaller example, your boundary doesn't have to be a spoken boundary. It can be something like, I don't answer the phone when you call, and I might send a text back, thanks for the note, or thanks for the message, or I might come for Christmas but stay for 30 minutes and have a code word and we leave. And I think too, everybody's process is their own and it's their own journey. So even if you're the person who's caused harm and you offer reconciliation, it doesn't mean they're going to take it right away. And that's their process. You also have to respect their boundaries, because the most important thing is that you make that peace within yourself.
And I think this can be especially difficult in the church because we center this person, Jesus, who was brutalized and in the narrative holds no boundaries, like takes the full kind of brunt of abuse. And I've seen it in the church where that story gets used as a reason to keep victims in places of being victimized. It's a narrative, both like externally, like it's said to people, and in the internal narrative. When I think we need to like look at what happens with Jesus as a picture of what happens when there are no boundaries. Like there are no healthy boundaries in the story of Jesus, and he gets publicly brutalized, right? And so I think, again, when we look at even the story of Genesis we're talking about today, is this awakening of that if we just kind of let society happen and we have no boundaries and no process and no healing, people will hurt people and continue to hurt people. And the powerful will continue to prey on the marginalized. It's how the world is functioning. And the Jesus story becomes this example of like, this is the depth of it. This is the full extent of it. And so I think actually the story of Jesus gives us this permission to set boundaries, or this invitation, like you should set boundaries. You should not continue in a place where you continue to be victimized and continue to harm what God calls very good, right? And so I wanted to have a conversation today about some of the ways this plays out in faith communities specifically. I thought it would be disingenuous of us to have a conversation called Church Needs Therapy and not talk about the ways that the church really needs some therapy, you know? So one of the ways that this plays out in what I just described is what is called spiritual bypassing. And so it's looking at a situation or a person who is experiencing something, and then from a place of spiritual authority, using spiritual language to go around the person or to disqualify or minimize that person's experience or story with spiritual language. So sometimes it can be as soft as someone is walking through something with their mental health. And the narrative is, well, if you just prayed more, oh, you must have something that is in your life that you haven't repented of. That's why this is happening. Versus talking to that person like a complete person and a full human. It's like, I will pray for you and like, we don't need to give this like soft answer that it's because of something you've done or something you did. But people, we're complex beings. Society's a complex place. Have you seen that kind of spirit? I mean, I've seen it a ton on the church side. Have you seen that in your office, in your chair? Do you walk a lot with people who have experienced this kind of spiritual bypassing? And how does that reinforce itself in someone's life?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's interesting because some people know it, right? They might say, this is how I grew up and this is playing out in my life. But I think it's amazing how many people don't know it. And it comes up with maybe different modalities of treatment that I'm using where it comes up. And they're like, oh, man. So, yeah, it comes up. I mean, I experienced that as a kid. I need to pray more, pray harder, or, you know, this person was doing this thing because I wasn't doing enough. And I think those narratives are so damaging and shame-based, right? Where you feel like there's something wrong with you or God doesn't love you. And it creates this distorted, almost like view of God as this dictator who's looking down on you and you're not behaving enough, you know? So kind of the example I gave last week of like the passive woman, I think when you see that in a church setting growing up, like if that's the narrative, or even if it's somebody who maybe is coming out of an abusive situation and, is entering into a church family for support and they're looking for somebody to support them, it ends up coming up as this narrative of like, I'm doing something wrong and what's wrong with me, and then they end up pleasing and don't trust themselves, right? Because it's external, you're not doing enough, instead of like, how can I meet you in that, Because again, it's not always your fault. And so I think going back to like teaching people to listen to their body again, like if somebody's, like you said that and I was like, ooh, it's all cringy. Like I was listening to my body sensations because they communicate about how something feels, and we're kind of taught to bypass that too.
And I want to take this a step further, and I think what we're about to talk about is a really complex conversation, but I don't think we can avoid it because of the state of faith communities. I think faith communities have a certain vulnerability to certain kinds of abuse because of the practices that we have, because of the narratives that exist, because of the way power dynamics can work in a community and in a faith community. And so in a lot of situations, spiritual bypassing can exist inside of a system or under a leadership that is actually spiritually abusive. And so clinically, we're hearing this conversation about spiritual abuse emerge a lot more in the age of information, because now like faith leaders and people that are coming out of these faith communities can talk to each other. And we're starting to see consistencies around the globe in the kinds of abuses that show up in churches. You could look like in the news right now in Michigan, there's 2 churches in our state walking through some really terrible abuse situations that were covered by the church and church people, not necessarily the leadership of the church, but the culture of the whole thing covers it up. And so I wanted to actually start with a definition, which is not very conversational, but I think will be helpful for us today on what is spiritual abuse. I'm going to read this for us, and I think it'll be behind me as well. But spiritual abuse is a form of emotional and psychological abuse. It is categorized by systematic pattern of cohesive and controlling behavior in a religious context. So it's like a really specific intersection. Spiritual abuse can have a deeply damaging impact on those who experience it. This abuse may include, and I think this list can be really helpful in developing tools to spot things early because of a faith community's susceptibility to this stuff. So this abuse may include manipulation, exploitation, enforced accountability, censorship of decision-making. So a lot of people have these stories of, the pastor or the church wouldn't let me make my own decisions, or they want to censor my decision-making. requirements for secrecy or silence. Things happen in a faith community, and there's a requirement on leadership to stay quiet about it. Coercion to conform, so a faith community where you're not allowed to ask questions is a part of this picture. Control through the use of sacred texts or teaching. Requirement of obedience to the abuser. So I think this plays out inside of churches and sometimes inside of families. I've walked with people who are in really abusive families, and then Sunday morning they're in church, and the reinforcement is, well, that's the head of the household, right? You just need to submit to that, right? The suggestion that the abuser has a divine position. So this can happen in really explicit ways, like talking about a leader as divine, but I think also access to the divine. So it's like, well, you don't know. Let me tell you, because I'm a pastor and I have an education, I'm a holy man, or whatever, how this should play out. Isolation is a means of punishment. So someone comes forward and shares something and they're isolated from the community. Or superiority and elitism. So again, this idea that some people have more access to God or power or wisdom than others. So all of these things, this conversation of spiritual abuse, it expresses in a lot of different ways. But I found this list really helpful in discernment, in being able to think about different situations in my life, different things that have happened, and be like, wait a minute, that's a part of a larger toxic, abusive culture. And yeah, anything you want to say about that, share about that?
It's just a really big topic.
It's huge.
I think all forms of abuse have a power differential, right? So if you think about like a child who is sexually abused, it's usually a person they trust and a relationship is built, and so then it becomes something where they question themselves, right? Or I hear this all the time, I must have done something or made it seem okay or something, right? And I think it's the same in spiritual abuse. We have this view of like, no offense, Corey, but like pastors being holy and above us and having all this stuff figured out.
I'm so offended.
Right? I just called you out. But I think, and so people enter that vulnerable space looking for like leadership and guidance and all of these things, which is, again, establishing trust. And if it's something where somebody is in that pathological space, that can be grooming to kind of get you in their corner so they can kind of, manipulate and do the things that they need you to do because it feeds that position of power. I think it can happen in I've had clients who've come from what I would call probably religious cults within a denomination where the whole denomination functions that way and they speak that way to each other. You see it on social media. You see people doing it on social media about political things or whatever else, reinforcing things. So there's a whole spectrum of it, but I think it really affects the ability to trust yourself. It really affects your perspective of God. It can be a total crisis if it's your culture, because what do you do if you have to leave that? And I think one of the things I would say that is so brave is if you realize it's happening to you, to tell a trusted friend and get out and get the help that you need, because I think the silence is what keeps it alive. Yes. And round we go. And this is why you see things in the media coming out about different churches who have done things to children or other people, because it happens everywhere, but we just pretend that it doesn't. And I think one more thing I would add is, and you kind of just mentioned this, but Christian people are not exempt. I had this conversation last week that, sexual abuse happens in Christian homes. We are not exempt. Just because we are good people and go to church doesn't mean that we don't have our stuff. And so I think, not to make people leery, but just aware. Be careful with who you trust. And if anything feels off to your body where you're not sure, that is your body telling you it's not safe for you.
Man, I wish we could talk for hours about this, but we can't. But I also felt like it was really important to bring this conversation to our community so we can keep talking about it, because it's a reality. It's a space we're in right now as faith communities in this country and in this part of the world. And we need to develop wisdom to be able to move through these moments and know how to support one another when these conversations come up. And begin to build new systems. I think in the context of spiritual abuse, this is probably true in all kinds of abuse, is that bad actors don't exist in a vacuum. There is a system at play that allows that to happen, that promotes that to happen, and continues to protect the abusers. And I think that's what the first 11 chapters of Genesis are pointing to. As you continue the narrative of the story, it's a lot of what Jesus is trying to undermine through his life. and through his death said, look how terrible this system is. This person has lived a perfect life. And because he's standing with the oppressed and standing with the victims, he's being oppressed and victimized himself. And so I think that window allows us as the church to maybe have a more whole conversation about this. And so thank you, Rachel, for helping us have this conversation. Can we thank Rachel today?
Lord, as we turn to you, come free us from our sin. We only have today, so let us now begin from dawn to dusk. Waking up from dawn to dusk. Waking up. Tomorrow's freedom is today's surrender. We come before you, lay our burdens down. We look to you as our hearts remember. You are the only God. You are our only God. Lord, as we turn to your spirit swells within, 'cause you are holy, holy, Lord. So let us now begin from dawn to dusk. Waking up from dawn to dusk. Waking up. Tomorrow's freedom is today's surrender. We come before you, lay our burdens down.